Welcome to our daily dose of nature with natural habitat adventures. Our topic today, mountain gorillas on the rise, a conservation success story. And our presentation today is brought to you by Mark Jordahl. He is coming to you from Gold Hill, Colorado. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate you getting it all set up, and I appreciate everybody being here. There's no surprise in the fact that this is kind of an odd time in the world, and it makes me happy to see that so many people are still trying to find ways to connect with nature, even if we're doing it from our own homes. So I'm happy to be a part of that. I hope you enjoy this, and I hope that your mind is able to wander a little farther than our bodies are able to these days. And it's really fun to be able to do a presentation on some of the good news in conservation. And mountain gorillas are definitely one of those groups of species that's doing very well right now. And to first just get a sense of how lucky we are that mountain gorillas are even around and that we're able to see them, you have to get a sense of how big Africa is. So many of us grew up with the Mercator projection maps that we think Greenland and Africa are about the same size. But you can see from this image that a lot of the world fits into Africa. It's a really enormous continent. And to understand what a small piece of that is, where the gorillas can be found, you need to have the sense of that scale. So now we're kind of zeroing in here on the range states of the mountain gorillas. They're only found in this tiny intersection of Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Rwanda. Very, very small part of the world. And these are their two ranges. They live in just a few hundred square miles shared by those three countries. And you can see these two different ranges are only separated by about 30 miles. So we're talking about a very small part of the world and a relatively small population of animals. Back in the 1960s, there were so few that most of the world had kind of given up on them. The Rwandan government in the 1970s were about to give a third of Volcanoes National Park away as a lease to a cattle ranch. At that time, park visitation to go just explore the forest was bringing in about $7,000 a year. This cattle lease would bring in about $70,000 a year. So for the Rwandan government, it was kind of a no-brainer. It really made sense. Nobody believed back then that people would actually hike and exert themselves to go see gorillas. So they were getting ready to get rid of it, and then a couple of Diane Fossey's graduate students, Amy Vetter and Bill Weber, kind of changed the narrative on it and said, well, no, we actually believe that people would want to come see mountain gorillas and that they'd be willing to trek to do it. So over time, they convinced the Rwandan government to keep the land protected, keep Volcanoes National Park intact. And we're all really glad that they did, because since that time, there's been a nice gradual increase in numbers of mountain gorillas. You can see from this graph, the last census from 2012 had 880. We have almost 200 more than that now, with well over 1,000 mountain gorillas in these three states. It's always amazing to watch an endangered species get downgraded. It was initially critically endangered. Now mountain gorillas are endangered, which basically means they're, still endangered. They're still under threat, but their situation is improving. And through incredible heroic conservation efforts on the part of these three countries and a lot of individuals and conservation organizations, their remaining habitat has been well protected and their numbers have been able to increase. So it's always exciting to just see some success stories like this in the world of conservation. And I want to touch a little bit on what it takes to actually get these numbers, because a mountain gorilla census is not an easy undertaking. This is the southern edge of Windy Impenetrable National Park, and Impenetrable is a pretty appropriate name. What the researchers have to do to count mountain gorillas is do a transect across the forest. And what that means is if you look straight out across this, you basically have to walk a straight line all the way across the forest and look for mountain gorilla nests. And they do that twice. So you have a group of researchers spread out by about 100 yards each, and they have to walk a straight line through this forest and up and over those mountains. So it's definitely not an easy undertaking. And what they're looking for are these. These are mountain gorilla nests. And each mountain gorilla, once they're out of infancy, each mountain gorilla makes its own nest each night. So once you find a nest site, you can count the number of nests, and that tells you how many mountain gorillas are in that family. And we're also very fortunate that each mountain gorilla tends to leave a little pile of DNA either right in the middle of their nest or right on the edge of the nest. And what that means is that the researchers are able to take a sample of that dung and they send it away to labs in the United States or the UK and have the DNA analyzed and then stored in a database. And this is why this is really the most thorough and accurate census we've ever had. We can feel a lot of confidence in that number of 1,064 because these samples have been analyzed. We know they're not being double counted. And an additional benefit of that is that if there ever is a poaching incident, if there's an incident of a baby mountain gorilla being captured for the illegal pet trade, if that gorilla is found alive, it can be returned to its family because from a DNA test, they know exactly which family it came from. And if it's unfortunately not, then they know where enforcement needs to be increased. They know where the poaching incidents are happening. Even without the official numbers, it was pretty obvious already that the numbers were increasing. Every time we're out there, we just see tons of these cute little guys out there. They're healthy, they're happy, they're playing. It's really a treat to see them, and it's always just encouraging with any endangered species, with rhinos, with elephants, with orangutans, with mountain gorillas. It's always encouraging to see young because a stressed population doesn't breed and a non-breeding population doesn't grow. So it's a really good sign that we're seeing so many of these babies when we're out there. And then I want to return to this map here, because as an ecologist, one of the things that I wondered about, was concerned about, was thinking about the fact that, okay, we have these very small habitats. Each of those ranges is 130, 140 square miles, so very small. And there's no gene flow between those two populations. There's even been consideration on the part of scientists of whether they should be ranked as two separate subspecies because there is no flow. So, you know, you can't help but think, okay, we have very small plots of habitat. We have increasing numbers of gorillas. Inbreeding is one thing that immediately popped into my mind hearing about these numbers increasing. This is the edge of Windy Impenetrable National Park. It's a sharp line. There's been agriculture between these two sections of habitat for hundreds, if not thousands of years. This is Rwanda. If you think about those volcanoes there, they're basically islands of habitat for the mountain gorillas, completely surrounded by agriculture. And the gorillas are just not really able to move between the two ranges. So you have a very restricted range, which fortunately now is pretty well protected, but no flow. So what does that mean for the gorillas? Is inbreeding going to be an issue? And it turns out, fortunately, that they're really not seeing that that is an issue. Mountain gorillas have good genes. They have been a small population for so long that what they're finding now is that deleterious genes, or genes that lead to negative or bad mutations, are actually getting forced out of the population. Over here on the left in the kind of light yellow mustard color, this is the western lowland gorilla. Over here to the right, the kind of pinkish colors, That's where the eastern gorillas are. And the mountain gorilla is a subspecies of the eastern gorilla. And these two, the western and the eastern populations, separated from each other, or began their separation from each other probably somewhere around 1 million years ago. And there was, over the years, a certain amount of gene flow between the west and the east, but that completely stopped sometime in the last, between the last 150,000 and the last 20,000 years. And the belief is that it was probably climate induced. During the last glacial maximum, a lot of water and moisture was locked up in the ice caps, which meant that these forests really dried up. And the two places where gorillas are still found were refugia during that time. They stayed moist, they stayed forested. And as the forest started to come back during the post-glacial period, as everything got wetter again, the forest started to grow back, there were a lot of rivers through there, like the Congo River and hundreds of others. And primates like mountain gorillas don't like to swim. They're not comfortable with water. If they need to cross a river, cross a creek, they'll look for a down log. They'll look for rocks that they can go across. They don't like to end up in the water. So a river as big as the Congo was a hard barrier. And what they've found is that the Western population of lowland gorillas are far more genetically diverse than the Eastern gorillas. The Eastern gorillas are, the lowland only now have about 3,800, and then again, the mountain gorillas have about 1,000. And these small populations have been in place now for at least 20,000 years. So they have actually adapted to be healthier at this small population level. And those genes do not cause bad mutations for them. Even with the good news, we can't just assume that everything's fine and the numbers are going to keep going up. A lot of the pressures that were on the gorillas when their population was down to just a couple hundred are still there. This is one of the most densely populated parts of Africa and of the world. All three of these countries, Rwanda, Congo, and Uganda, are primarily agricultural. So that means that land around the forests is going to keep getting farmed. And it's just not realistic to think about having a corridor connecting those. There is still political instability on the Congo side, even though Rwanda and Uganda are both very stable and those mountain gorilla populations are pretty safe. There is still habitat encroachment, people wanting to increase the size of their farms, or as their family size increases, their kids need some place to farm. So there is still pressure on these parks and on these boundaries. In addition to those pressures, now we've added COVID-19. And this is a very timely topic right now, obviously. These mountain gorillas are very close cousins of ours. We share about 98% of their DNA, and we can share diseases as well. They're called zoonotic diseases when they can pass between humans and animals. And as we know, the belief right now is that this coronavirus did pass to humans from animals in wet markets in China. In this case, with the great apes, so the mountain gorillas, the chimpanzees, orangutans, they are definitely at risk of us passing this disease to them. Mountain gorillas are particularly susceptible to respiratory illnesses. Even a common cold from a human can potentially kill a mountain gorilla. And also with them living at 10, 11, 12,000 feet, obviously anything that impacts the respiratory system is going to be a real challenge to the life of that mountain gorilla. So Rwanda and Congo have both closed their parks to tourism temporarily, just to protect the mountain gorillas from exposure from tourists who might be positive with the coronavirus. Uganda hasn't officially closed their parks, but they have closed their borders. So they are effectively, the parks are closed to tourism because nobody's going there right now. There's definitely the right choice in terms of the health of the mountain gorillas, but there are other impacts that come from that lack of tourism. And yeah, so you can see mountain gorillas are not great at maintaining social distancing. They're very, very affectionate with each other. The the whole families just spend their days as close as possible to each other. The young are climbing on the adults, on the silverbacks, on their mothers. The young are wrestling with each other. So if coronavirus was to get into the mountain gorilla populations, this could really be a huge threat, not only on a family basis, but there are interactions between mountain gorillas in one family and in another, either through using the same area for feeding, because mountain gorillas don't guard a home territory, they guard their family. Their family kind of is the territory. So multiple families may use the same area, and those germs could be left behind by one family to be picked up by another family. And then there are also the occasional conflicts between families, which do result in physical contact between particularly the silverbacks, which would be another possibility to spread the virus. And again, you can imagine with such small ranges, such limited habitat, if the coronavirus got in there, it could spread quickly. So definitely it was the right choice in terms of just locking things down to protect the health of the gorillas. And I think we'll be seeing the same thing with chimpanzees and orangutans as well. But there are downsides to having tourists out of the forest. For one thing, there just aren't as many eyes out there. One thing about having gorilla trekking groups in these forests is that we're traveling unpredictable routes because we go wherever the gorillas are. We're in the forest with armed rangers. We're there with guides and trackers who have really well-trained eyes that are attuned to seeing small snares in the forest. Generally, those snares aren't intended to capture the gorillas. They're more for forest antelopes, little dikers, and things like that. But gorillas, like humans, are very curious, and they frequently will get caught in those snares. And again, in places like Congo, where it's less stable, there is the threat of poaching coming in. And it's, having tourists, having rangers, having guides in the forest on a daily basis really does help protect the gorillas. The other thing is just the simple economics of it. The mountain gorilla permits fund so much of the conservation work, not only for the gorillas themselves, but in Uganda in particular, the mountain gorilla permits fund about 50% of the entire park system's budget. So elephants and leopards and rhinos, there are a lot of other species who are also helped by these permits. So the loss of tourism, while on the one hand, it's a good way to protect the health of the gorillas, it also does open them up to other threats. The economic impacts are enormous on the communities bordering these parks. So many of them are supported by and work in tourism. These are some of the porters from our gorilla treks. 1 in 10 people in the world is employed either directly or indirectly by the tourism industry. And again, these are rural areas, and apart from subsistence agriculture, there really aren't a lot of other options, other ways for people to make money. And I just want to throw out there how incredibly appreciative and touched we all are by the outpouring of support for our Community Relief Fund, because it really is the people around these parks who are benefiting directly from that fund. And we're really excited to be able to keep some income in the hands of people, even as the regular tourism revenue and tourism jobs have started to dry up right now. But when you are trying to feed your family and you have suddenly lost your income, think about what you would do to make sure you could put food on the table for kids. Some people do end up turning to poaching to be able to get food, or in more commercial poaching just to get the income from that. And again, it's a little bit easier now because there are fewer people, fewer eyes out there in the forest. But even if you just are going into the forest to collect firewood, to collect edible plants, to collect medicinal plants, all the things that you need to do, again, just to help your family survive, if you've been exposed to coronavirus and then you go into the forest to gather those resources, you're increasing the chance of the virus being spread to the gorillas. In '94, there was an outbreak of scabies that ended up killing a number of mountain gorillas just because they started to lose their hair. They got hypothermic because it does get cold in these forests at night. And that was because of people from the boundary communities going in to collect resources. So with tourism revenue drying up, we really need to be looking at how can we replace that? How can we help support the people around the communities, both in an economic sense in terms of income and food for themselves, but also from a health point of view. This is an organization called Conservation Through Public Health, which is doing incredible work, particularly in the communities right around Bwindi. They actually began after that scabies outbreak in 1994. The woman who runs it, Gladys, was the first female vet in the Uganda Wildlife Authority, and she realized that you can't address the health and the conservation of the gorillas without also looking at the health of the communities around. So she really explicitly made that connection between health and conservation. And now they have groups of community educators who go out and do talks with community members about how do you maintain personal hygiene. What is a safe way to chase a gorilla out of your crops, because they will sometimes leave the forest to go feed in farmlands. So, you know, again, if you're not trained in how to chase a gorilla out of your field, you might end up having contact with them. And again, that's another opportunity for the virus to spread. So COVID has had a lot of impacts on the conservation of wildlife and on the communities living around the parks. And yeah, the people who are doing the work on the front lines around these parks are they're absolute heroes, and they're doing whatever they can to make sure that the communities are healthy, and therefore the gorillas will be healthy and will be protected. When we are able to go start tracking the gorillas again, and I do hope it will be soon, because I miss it. I miss the gorillas. I miss being able to travel, as I'm sure so many of you, I'm sure you feel the same way. Definitely excited to get back out there. And when we do get back out there, I think for a lot of great ape tourism, we're going to be seeing a lot more of this. This is something that we can do as visitors, as tourists, to do our part to help protect the gorillas. As I said, even something as simple as a common cold can potentially kill a mountain gorilla. So we really do have to go above and beyond to make sure that we are not passing our germs on to any great ape that is subject to the same illnesses that we are. And it's, you know, there's a requirement of staying 7 meters away from the gorillas when we're there with them, which is, you know, beyond our 6 feet of social distancing right now. But it's incredibly difficult to maintain that distance because the gorillas often are as curious about us as we are about them. So they don't seem to understand that 7 meter distance. So they'll frequently come right up next to us or even rub up against us. So we really will need to do everything that we can to make sure that we're doing our part and that the population of mountain gorillas does continue to grow into the future. We have seen from these genetic studies that they can continue to grow in population size for many years to come without having it be a real threat to them genetically. We don't really know yet what the carrying capacity of these forests are, but Bwindi impenetrable. There's a section of forest connected by a small corridor that still doesn't have gorillas in it yet, so there's room for expansion there. The Rwandan government is very actively working to expand the borders of Volcanoes National Park. So there are a lot of efforts to make sure that the mountain gorillas are able to continue to expand, that their numbers can keep increasing, and that we can make sure that the habitat that's remaining to them stays there for them for many years to come. And I want to just open it up to questions now. I tend to talk for too long, so I really tried this time to leave enough time for questions. So thank you.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. And it's just been we've got a very enthusiastic audience and a lot of questions. So we're going to just jump right into those. There is a question here. It says, any distinct physical differences, size, etc., between mountain and lowland gorillas?
Yeah, so eastern lowland gorillas, which are now known as Grauer's gorillas, are the largest of the gorilla species. They're slightly larger than the mountain gorillas, which are the next largest. The mountain gorillas are mostly distinguished just by longer hair, is kind of the big difference. Because they live in such colder environments than the lowland gorillas, they really have evolved that longer hair just to survive those cold nights that can sometimes get below freezing. You'll also see kind of the larger sagittal crest, that kind of big bump on the back of the gorilla's head. Those are a little bit larger in the mountain gorillas because of they mostly eat vegetation, which requires a lot of chewing to get it into a form that they can fully digest it and get the nutrients out of it. And then you have the western lowland gorillas, which are smaller again. And the western lowland gorillas are the ones that, if you go to the zoo, those are the ones that you see in the zoo. They've never been able to keep mountain gorillas alive in zoos. So the only place that you can encounter the mountain gorillas is in the wild.
And yeah, so in speaking of keeping them alive, what is their average lifespan?
They can live to about 30 to 50 years. 50 years would be extremely old. A silverback in particular, just like human men, we tend to get ourselves into environments that can hurt us. So it would be more common for a male to live in more of that 35 age range. Females can live a little bit longer, 40, 45, because they're not as often having the direct conflicts with another gorilla family. Silverbacks will occasionally try to take over another family from another silverback, and those encounters can be very violent, even though in general mountain gorillas are incredibly peaceful and just tranquil. Their battles over families can be very violent, and a silverback will fight to the death to protect its family.
Okay, thank you. We have several people interested in the diet of the mountain gorilla, and we're so combining a few questions here. What do they eat, and how much each day?
Yeah, they will eat, the females will eat about 50 pounds a day, the males about 75 pounds a day. And with the mountain gorillas, it's about 99% vegetation and 1% insects. So really, they're vegetarians. They're eating wild celery. They're eating nettles. And one of their favorite treats is bamboo shoots. Generally, in the course of a day when they're feeding, they won't cover more than about a quarter mile over the course of an entire day, unless it's the season for bamboo shoots to be coming up. And then there are great memories come into play. They know where the bamboo shoots are. They can associate it with the wet season, and they know when the shoots are going to start coming up. And they'll travel quite a few miles just to get to where those bamboo shoots are coming up, because they're very high in protein, whereas a lot of the other plants that they eat aren't. So it's particularly important for the young who are growing to get those fresh bamboo shoots.
Okay.
Oh, and another just kind of interesting side note on the food is, so the females are the ones that generally will disperse from the family. They'll leave their natal family to go join another family so that they're breeding with the silverback that they're not immediately related to. But they will be stopped by an area where they're not familiar with the vegetation. They have certain preferences that they like. If they get into an area where they don't recognize the food, they will turn back. And that is something that's been a question around the idea, even if you could connect a corridor between Bwindi and the Virunga Massif, the gorillas wouldn't necessarily make that move, because the elevation difference is great enough and the vegetation difference is great enough that they might not recognize it and be tempted to travel.
Well, that leads me to another question. Is there one matriarch living with the silverback?
The silverback will mate with multiple females. So generally, the oldest female will have some kind of additional authority, if you can call it that, within the family. But really, with both the males and females, a certain amount of your dominance comes from how well you're able to care for young. So the matriarch really gains that authority by being a wise and careful mother. So the silverback will mate with multiple females in the family. So it's not like an alpha wolf male and female pair where they're the only breeding pair. Um, all of the females within the family will mate, will breed, but generally the oldest female in the troop is sort of the one who can sort of guide the younger mothers in how to raise their young. But really, when it comes down to ultimate authority within the family, it's generally the silverback. And you'll notice that when you're with them, that when the silverback gets up and decides it's time to leave, the whole family leaves. He really tends to maintain pretty complete authority over the whole group, even the oldest female in the group.
Mm-hmm. So, the silverback, what makes them different? Is there? I think you touched on this. So, there's only one silverback per family. Are they identifiable from birth?
So there actually can be multiple silverbacks within a family. There's always one dominant silverback. And basically the difference, males and females, and no, you can't recognize it from birth. Any male will ultimately become a silverback. It's just a physiological change that happens when they turn right around 13. They start to get that gray saddle, the silver saddle. But males and females grow at about the same rate until they're about 8 or 9 years old, and they'll be about 250, 300 pounds at that point. Then the females will stop growing, and the males will continue to grow. And the largest silverbacks have gotten up to close to 600 pounds. So there's a huge size difference between a mature female and a mature male. And then within the family, again, they're so close to us as kind of sharing this great apeness about us. Each silverback really does have its own personality, and some are more laid back and some are more aggressive. And a dominant silverback may even choose to allow multiple other silverbacks, will allow them to remain in the family because they can help protect the family against any outside aggressive silverback that might be coming in trying to take over the family. So there are even times when an older dominant silverback is kind of aging out and it's time for succession. Usually one of his sons will take over, and often will even allow that the father to stay in the family for that exact reason, that the father can still help protect the family. But if it's a more aggressive young silverback, he may chase the father away, and then that will be a solitary male probably for the rest of his life.
That's kind of sad.
Yeah,
How large? Yeah. How large is a typical family?
They can be up to about 30, but most of them are kind of in the 10 to 20 range. And that includes generally, one or two silverbacks, 3 or so blackbacks, which are males who are about 8 to 13. So they haven't started getting their silver saddle yet, but they're kind of sub-adults. So they'll be in there, 2 or 3 adult females, and then a group of young. And like I said, there are a lot of babies out there now. So it's not uncommon to come across a family that has 5 or 8 young that are in that 0 to 3 range. And each female will have about 6 young over the course of their life, and pretty much never more than 1 at a time, just for all primate species. When you're climbing around, moving around, going up into trees, if you have multiple babies, it's just too hard to keep a hand on all of them and keep them all safe.
Yeah. Well, I had a baby question for you next, which was, how long do they stay with their mother?
Yeah, they may spend their whole life in the same family with the mother. In terms of that close, immediate contact, by 3 years of age, they've moved into adolescence. They're juveniles at that point. So they're no longer sleeping with the mother. They share a nest up to about 3 years. They're in constant contact for the first 6 or 8 months, and then they'll kind of gradually start separating. But for another year, they might never be more than 10 or 15 feet away from their mother. And they'll keep nursing for those first few years. And again, that's partly why there's such a big birth interval, and why the females don't have that many young over the years, is they're still so attached to each baby for the first 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to ask you one more question, sort of about the the families, and then I have some sort of more big picture questions for you.
Mhm.
We might get back to some of those of this theme in a minute. Can you describe their methods of communication? How well is their communication understood?
Mhm. By each other or by us?
I think both. Yeah, I think that's a two-part question.
Yeah, they do a lot of communication, and I wish I could do an imitation of them as well as the rangers in the park do. But there's sort of this content grunt that they'll do, and that's just a sign of contentedness. And that is what the rangers will often do just to let the silverback know when we're there visiting them, hey, everything's okay. We're just hanging out. Everybody's calm. So that's one where there's a very clear communication between the humans in the situation and the mountain gorillas. But then almost constantly between the family members, there was a recent article. They have these cameras out now that are disguised to be like a baby mountain gorilla, and they've recorded singing between the mountain gorillas. And it's just sort of these contented little sounds that just keep the whole family in contact. The silverback always wants to know where every member of the family is. So there's almost constant vocalizations going on just so that they can stay in contact with each other because they're in such dense forest. It would be really easy to get separated and lose each other, at least visually, if you weren't kind of keeping those contact calls going. And then they also have smell signals. And you can often smell the silverback when you're still 50 or 100 yards away. You don't even know for sure that you're up on the family, but you will start to smell them. And they have sort of their regular odor, which is fairly pungent. And then if they feel that they're under threat, that odor will actually change with stress pheromones or hormones. And that is a signal to the family. So even if they don't hear a vocal signal from him, they'll know that something's up and they'll start grouping up around him until he takes them to safety. And then finally, the kind of most dramatic vocalization that we get is when they do the bluff charges. And that's the classic beating on the chest, up on the hind two legs, running towards you and shrieking. And that can be a terrifying moment. And what you need to do is just stand there and look down at the ground, which kind of goes against every instinct you have. But again, it's always a bluff charge. They're not trying to harm us in any way, but it's a very clear signal where they're just trying to communicate to us that they're the boss.
Yeah. Okay. I bet that's. Have you run into that?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It gets your blood moving.
Yes, I bet. I bet. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some sort of worldview type questions, and then we'll come back to some more questions about habit and habitat. Um, so COVID has highlighted the dangers of dependence on tourism dollars for much of conservation areas. What other non-tourist programs that have successfully helped humans and apes in their forests coexist and maintain ape populations?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. Tourism is the low-hanging fruit, if you will. It's the easiest, most obvious way to bring in a lot of revenue. But one example, as an alternative, to go back to that organization, Conservation Through Public Health, that I was talking about, they have worked with the local farmers to set up coffee co-ops. And there are two benefits to that. First of all, they grow a very high quality Arabica coffee bean in that area because of the volcanic soils and the elevation. So they make incredible coffee. They grow incredible coffee. Conservation Through Public Health is able to then process it, market it, and sell it at a premium, so that they get more money than they would just selling on the open market. The second advantage to that, though, is that gorillas haven't yet figured out the wonders of coffee. So if you have a piece of land that borders one of the gorilla parks, the gorillas, like I said, will come out of the forest to feed on your crops. It's a great, easy source of food, a high nutritional value. Um, but coffee and tea acts as a barrier. So the gorillas will turn back if they find themselves in a coffee or tea plantation. So not only are the farmers able to get money from selling the coffee, but it's also just a good physical barrier for their farm. And then a couple other things that people are doing that more so than for gorillas is protecting communities against conflict with elephants are beehives along the boundaries of parks and chili plants, both of which can be sold as cash crops. And the chilies, again, are not palatable to the elephants and can be sold. And then with the honey, the sound of the bees drive the elephants back into the parks. So there are a number of, it's amazing how closely tied conservation is to economic development now. The gates and guns approach just doesn't work anymore. Communities have to be factored in. If you're going to be taking away access to the resources in the parks, we have a responsibility to help develop alternatives to that. So there are a lot of these efforts to try to figure out economic development and products that can be sold, which especially if they can be sold on the local market rather than only to tourists.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so for those of us sitting at home, could you give us maybe 2 to 3 key actions that we could take to continue protecting mountain gorillas?
Yeah, this is always, I always wish I had a list of 10 immediate actions to take. One is thinking about the products you're buying. To go back to coffee, Conservation through Public Health sells coffee called Gorilla Conservation Coffee. And you can just do a Google search for that, and buying products like that that put money into the hands of locals really incentivizes them and gives them an alternative to gathering resources from the forest. When you are in these areas, whether it's a mountain gorilla park or you're outside of Yosemite to view Yellowstone to see wolves, buy local products from the local communities. Again, it's getting that money into the hands of locals really makes a big difference in terms of incentivizing them and having them see that there's value in the wildlife being there, because that brings people there who want to see them and who therefore spend money there. The other thing is to think about do the research when you can into the products that you buy. Things like certified wood products are not always as responsibly harvested as we would like to think. There is enough corruption in a lot of countries around the world that sometimes wood products that we buy, especially endangered mahogany, rosewood, are coming directly out of the forests that mountain gorillas and other species rely on. So really doing your research, thinking about who you're buying products from. And then also, we don't really think about it, but just not buying things we don't need. Thinking about how often you need to replace your cell phone or your tablet or your laptop. A lot of what goes into those come out of these forests, especially in Congo, very mineral rich country. And they're in places like that without strong political controls. When there's so much money to be made from tantalum and other gold, copper, other materials that go into our products, it's easy for wildlife and forests to be threatened by the extraction of those things. So yeah, just really, when you're about to buy something, really think about, do you need it, and is there a more sustainable option?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So move back into some questions for you just about habits and habitat. And so there's a question here about how they behave when people are close by. I know you talked to us a little bit about that threat sound and all of that, but just in general, how are they when you're out in the field with them?
Yeah, incredibly calm and relaxed. At this point, they're so used to having people there that it feels like they just sort of factor it into their day. They're just going about their business. We usually get there while they're in one of their feeding or resting periods. Usually, when they first wake up, they travel for an hour, hour and a half. We usually get there sometime after that. So depending on how quickly we get to them, either they're in a feeding state where they're just, all kind of sitting on their own, munching away on the wild celery, um, or they're in a rest period, which is where the young are really playing with each other, climbing on the silverback. So they really do just go about their business. They're so used to us being there. And so we get 1 hour to be with them. And I'm convinced that the Silverbacks either have watches or they've just really learned what an hour feels like, because 8 times out of 10, right as the hour's coming up, the Silverback does a few grunts, the family gathers up together, and they head out into the forest. So it really seems like they are the ones almost more than us saying, okay, it's time to go. So I think they factor us in for our hour. Each family only gets visited for 1 hour per day. And when it's, they're completely relaxed, and the young are very curious about us. Like I said, they'll often run up to us, and it is difficult sometimes to maintain the necessary distance. But yeah, then when they're done, they just move on. So we're just part of their day.
So, do they have, apart from humans, do they have any natural predators?
Leopards will sometimes take the young, but really they don't. Snakes can sometimes be an issue, again, mostly for the young. But the silverbacks are so big and so protective that very little threatens them, and it's fairly unusual for a baby to even be taken by a leopard or any other predator. So really, it is kind of humans are the biggest threat.
Okay. Oh, let's see. There's a lot of interesting questions about reproduction and just carrying on with the family. At what age are males and females sexually mature?
Mhm. Females at about 8 or 9 years old, and the males at around 13. But the males will almost never breed until they're at least 15, because they don't have enough status. They don't, their silver saddle hasn't fully come in yet. And then again, it comes down to how tolerant is the dominant silverback. Um, about on average 15% of the young are sired by males other than the dominant silverback, but that still means 85% are from the dominant silverback. So yeah, it's the females will actually start to breed in that kind of 8 to 10 year old range, but for the males, the very earliest would be about 15 years old.
Okay. And then the gestation period, how long is that?
About 8.5 months, so pretty close to us.
Yep. Then are the silverbacks tolerant of the babies?
The silverbacks love the babies. It's one of my favorite things is to see this huge 500-pound silverback, and the babies just climb all over them and just tug at their hair, and they'll run into them and knock over. So yeah, the silverbacks are very affectionate towards the young. The young love that bonding with the silverback, and they've even there was a recent study. I haven't read the whole thing yet. It just came out recently, but saying that males are more likely to become a dominant silverback if they've shown that they are able to care for and connect with the young in the family. So yeah, it's actually a surprisingly close relationship, given that in a lot of mammal species, the male isn't that connected to the young.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Um, um, let's see, just a few more questions and then we'll wrap it up. Let's see, what factors have contributed to the growth of the mountain gorilla population?
Mhm. It pretty much 100% just the protection of that habitat. Um, like I said, in the 70s, the Virunga population was down to about 250. And they don't even know, they had never done a census in the Bwindi area. So estimates are around 100 or 200, something like that. So a very low population. And it's because, apart from Diane Fossey, nobody was really paying attention to them. Nobody was really putting effort into protecting those forests. So it was really when governments started to realize that they had a huge cash cow and revenue stream on their hands with the potential for guerrilla tourism, that they really put concerted efforts in, put resources in to protect what remained of those forests. And, most species left alone will breed and will increase if they're in a secure environment. And that's really what it took for the mountain gorillas, was just creating that secure environment, keeping those areas protected, keeping patrols going in the forests, and having that revenue through tourism just made all the difference.
Okay, cool. All right. Last question for you. How is climate change impacting mountain gorillas?
Yeah, that will be interesting to watch. So far, I would say it hasn't affected them too dramatically. However, as things warm, the dryness is going to work its way up the forests. The lushness of those forests will start to diminish. A lot of the undergrowth plants like the wild celery and the nettles and things like that will be having fewer of those. And also that's where they get their water. They don't drink from streams or anything like that. It's all from the vegetation. So over time, if you think about those forests drying out and kind of making their way up those mountains to stay in the same climate zone, it's not that much farther before those forests are at the top. And there just isn't anywhere else for them to go. So that's what I think we need to work to avoid in the future.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much. And I know that your kids were listening in the background as well, and I saw they asked some questions, and we tried to weave those in among the others. So that was really fun. They were listening to Dad. So let me turn it back to you now for closing comments.
All right. Yeah, I guess I just want to end with what I started with. We are in unusual, weird times right now, and just thank you to everybody on this call for keeping that connection to nature strong, even when we can't necessarily be physically out there exploring it. I still believe in its power to heal and keep us safe and sane. And I hope everyone out there is staying healthy and not touching your face.
My thanks as well. We appreciate having all of you here with us. This was a lot of fun, and tomorrow's topic is going to be nature photography in tropical destinations. So if you're interested in that, we'd love to have you join us, and we'll make sure that we get the replay to today's webinar out to all of you. Look for that in your email inbox by about this time tomorrow. So with that, we will wish you all a great day and conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you.